Hello, my name is Len Losik, and I'm here to discuss the physiology of gender expansion from a space medicine, AIDS, cancer, and DNA research perspective. I'm President and Chief Technical Officer of a company called Failure Analysis, located in Santa Cruz, California, just over here on Cooper Street. And my company licenses predictive algorithms as part of the prognostics and health management technology. It falls in the field of predictive analytics as well as predictive science. The uniqueness about PHM technology is that when we predict an event is going to occur, it's predicted with 100% certainty. And that is what's unique. It's, in the past has not been able to be done before. And so that's the uniqueness of the technology. As an expert in predictive analytics, in 2012, the Canadian Space Agency asked me if I would use my company's algorithms to see if I could predict which Canadian astronauts in training were going to develop a mental illness while on a deep space mission. And in that way, they could ensure that the folks that end up going on deep space missions wouldn't become mentally ill. And so I applied our technology, and our results are included in this presentation, as well as several publications. And the results of our research for the Canadian Space Agency also went over to NASA, and who are now responding to it as I speak. This next presentation will include explaining how what causes mental illness, that is the fight or flight response, changing the chemical ratios in the brain as a result of the conscious mind not getting the messages from the fight or flight response, not doing what the, not taking the actions that the fight or flight response wants the person to take, and then it keeps increasing the symptoms, causing people to take more and more medication. Eventually, what the medication does is that it reduces the effect of the discomfort that the fight or flight response is trying to give you, the symptoms, and so the people still continue to refuse to take the proper actions that the fight or flight response is demanding. And when you finally, at some point, the fight or flight response decides that it needs to take control, it then shoves the conscious mind aside, changes the ratio of the chemicals, and you end up with either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or a combination of the two. That will take you out of whatever situation you're in. You usually end up in a hospital. You're out of your relationship with your spouse, with your children, with work, with whatever it was that your fight or flight response decided was danger to yourself and it. You are now out of it. So it effectively worked by giving you mental illness. The fight or flight response took you out of the situation that it decided was dangerous for you. So by defining the cause of mental illness as a lack of communications between the fight or flight response and the conscious mind, this is a picture of meant to represent our entire brain and how much we believe the conscious mind uses versus what's available in our subconscious mind. As I mentioned earlier, we created the first model for mental illness. And here in Santa Cruz County, when I first started back in 2010, I went to the county and I asked them, where is all of the money spent for mental illness? And what they said was that 100% of the money that Santa Cruz County allocates for the mentally ill is all spent on talk therapy and drugs. No research, no attempt at trying to understand what causes it. It's all spent on pharmaceuticals, which is great for the pharmaceutical industry, and the talk therapy is great for the talk therapy psychology industry, and yet people aren't getting cured from their mental illnesses. So the reason that the brain does do what it does, the fight or flight response, is forced to cause a person to become either emotionally ill or mentally ill, is because unlike the rest of the body, the body has all kinds of sensors on it to let the brain know when it's injured or feeling pain or maybe going to suffer an injury. Well, the brain's encased in a skull, and so it has no nerves. In fact, surgeons that operate on brains can actually operate on a person while he's alive because the brain has no nerves. And so how does the brain tell the brain that there's something wrong? And the brain meaning the conscious mind. And it does so by feelings and emotions. And so if you've been raised in a poor environment where there's been abuse and neglect, and you've been raised improperly or being taken care of improperly, and you had developed survival skills, the communications between your fight or flight response and your conscious mind is going to be very poor. And so what's left for the fight or flight response to do is starts out with emotional problems, like starts out with depression, goes from there to perhaps an anxiety disorder, maybe then to major depression, which maybe throw in OCD symptoms. And then if you're on so much medication that those symptoms are no longer much of a problem for you, you're not taking the actions that the fight or flight response wants you to do. And so it's still seeing danger because you haven't taken the right actions. And so it then changes the chemical balance between those three chemicals that I spoke about earlier, causing you to either get bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And the only thing that I will say that is genetic based about mental illness is whether you're going to get bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or a combination of both. That is most likely to be genetic, but the actual cause of getting mental illness is pure environment. It's how you raised, what you had to do to survive. So I'll be covering that a little bit better in a few minutes. So our approach for defining mental illness was that we assumed that the nervous system in the brain was a closed system, and that communications with the subconscious was only one way, through the senses and the nervous system. And the interface, our conscious, what we're communicating with right now, that's our tool, the tool of our fight or flight response to interface with the world. The fight or flight response to our subconscious developed the conscious mind to interface with the world at a much with less information that it had access to. And so we asked the question, what happens when the conscious ignores the need of the subconscious? And we decided, that was what a mental illness was. And so it's likely to occur when people become unaware of their feelings and emotions for a variety of reasons. When depression is either ignored, or the medications that you take for the symptoms that you're getting from the fight or flight response are lowered, and you're not taking the correct actions that the fight or flight response wants you to in order to get out of the danger that it determines is present, that's when it kicks in. And so it gives us many chances to do what it wants us to do. And when we don't do what it wants us to do, it can, like I said, it starts out with either depression and anxiety, which means that the fight or flight response, if you're having anxiety attacks or so-called panic attacks, that means that the fight or flight response has determined imminent death is going to occur. That's why you're suffering. Okay? And so what do? You go to the doctor, you get anti-anxiety medication, relieves the symptoms, but you don't change your lifestyle. You make no changes in your life. And so the fight or flight response doesn't turn off. It's still seeing what you're doing and is going to continue to increase the number of harmful or painful symptoms for you to experience, trying to get your attention so that you'll do the actions that it wants you to. So when things like anxiety are ignored, then comes major depression, and then finally it's self-induced brain damage, which is the chemical composition change in the brain. And then the two major mental illnesses is bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, but the symptoms of those from either one can be intermixed between the two. And so the recipe for acquiring mental illness that we found was that generally from 2 to 5 years of overexposure to psychological and or physical danger as determined by your fight or flight response, not by your conscious mind, this triggers the near continuous release of cortisol and adrenaline this entire time, causing premature aging of the body as well as shrinkage of the brain, resulting in the fight or flight response determining that it's powerless to get the conscious mind to remove the threat. The fight or flight response determines it's out of control from the failure of the conscious mind to remove the threat that the fight or flight response is aware of, and the development of psychological survival strategies. And since it's unable to get away from the conscious or get the conscious to remove or get away from the threat, the fight or flight response forces the conscious to experience great pain and discomfort. However, today with so many psychotropic drugs, those symptoms can be reduced greatly, thus causing the person to remain in whatever dangerous situation that the fight or flight response determines is present. And so if the right decisions, as according to the fight or flight response, is not made, the fight or flight response initiates non-recoverable changes in the brain's chemistry, okay, that cause even more painful symptoms known as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. If the fight or flight response causes schizophrenia, it has begun to remove the conscious as its interface to the world. What that means is that while a person with schizophrenia is interacting with its subconscious directly with the conscious rather than with the conscious mind. So when I'm talking about messages from the fight or flight response, the feelings would include feeling happy, sad, fearful, guilty, anger, love, and embarrassment. And under each one of those feelings is a whole different group of experiences that you can experience as a result of feeling happy or having these feelings. And so these are the things that you become unable to experience as a result of suppressing your emotions as a survival mechanism due to whatever behavior that you were exposed to, usually growing up as a young person. So the power of the fight or flight response and its purpose, also known as our subconscious when it's not activated, I'm going to be talking about and how it decides it's going to be safe. So the fight or flight was developed strictly for the body to eliminate threats it perceives, and it is connected to every possible part of the body and every organ. And so this is meant to show a brain that has experienced premature aging. It's no longer circular, and you can see it. There's lobes and things instead of it being a nice smooth. And this is what people with severe mental illnesses. This is what occurs as a result of being exposed to cortisol and adrenaline. And so, in the mental health continuum model that is available, this just tries to show how people behave that are healthy, that are reactive, that are injured, and that are ill, in order to kind of group the feelings in different categories to help better understand them. And so, as I mentioned before, premature aging, this chart identifies important words. The word threat. What does the word threat mean? And what does the word stress mean? Versus what is a stressor? And what is a trigger? And so stress occurs with the release of cortisol and adrenaline by the fight or flight response. Stressors trigger the body's release of cortisol and adrenaline. And although you can be under stress, which is the presence of cortisol and adrenaline already in your body, the stressors trigger the release. And so that's the difference between stress, being under stress, and being exposed to a stressor that actually triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol. So a trigger means whatever event, action, thought, whatever it is that you see that causes the release of cortisol and adrenaline. So these are important words to understand very well. The words threat for the fight or flight response. When you're under stress, you've already got cortisol and adrenaline released. What a stressor is, the thing that triggers the release, and then what a trigger is. And that's what releases cortisol and adrenaline. And so examples of body's responses to triggers can be high blood pressure, surprise perspiration, insomnia, very common today, heart palpitations, anxiety, depression, unexplainable mood swings, unexplainable irritability, mouth, tongue, lip sores, chapped lips. Years ago there used to be a large conversation about people being addicted to chapped lips balm. And it wasn't that they were addicted to chapped lip balm, is that their fight or flight response was causing their lips to be dry. And they would then want to moisten them because it was uncomfortable. And it was, in fact, their fight or flight response letting them know that whatever they were doing, they needed a change, that it wanted some action to be taken. And then instead of, the lip balm doesn't cure the chapped lips, it's making a change in your life that gets rid of the chapped lips. So here's examples of the body's responses to stressors: heartburn, hemorrhoids, any kind of gastrointestinal issues, even Crohn's disease, mouth and tongue sores again, skin infections, pimples, rashes. Okay, these are again responses to stressors. Okay, colds and flus because the immune system is suppressed. Chapped lips, new allergic reactions, that is things that you weren't allergic to before, and even social withdrawal where you don't want to go out so much, you want to kind of be alone. And so in the space program, back in 2007, one of its female astronauts made the news, and her name was Captain Lisa Nowak, and she was ended up in the news because she was said to have driven from Houston in Texas to Florida to kill her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. And what was so fascinating about it was said that she wore diapers so that she wouldn't have to stop at any gas station or anything and to use the restroom so she could get there quicker. Well, people that work in space lose about 10% of their body weight every 6 months, and this is full body weight. Okay, this can be brain matter, this can be muscle tissue, this can be organ tissue, 10%, okay? And so that's every 6 months. NASA has reported that some of their astronauts have experienced anxiety and depression. Well, Miss Nowak, when she was arrested and she went to trial, she was in the Navy, she was a captain in the Navy, she was in the NASA's astronaut program, and when she went to trial, she had been diagnosed with 3 different mental illnesses, and she refused to believe that she was mentally ill and to use her mental illnesses as the reason for her actions when she drove to Florida to kill her ex-boyfriend's girlfriend. They were no longer in a relationship, but because she was mentally ill, it told her that she needed to do that. And as a result of her refusal to use her in her defense, the fact that she was mentally ill, she was demoted and then kicked out of the astronaut program and kicked out of the Navy, and she had her retirement as a result of her demotion. She had her retirement reduced in the amounts, all because she was not aware that she was mentally ill, nor would she accept that she was mentally ill. And that is a very common occurrence among the mentally ill. To them, everything's normal. They don't see the fact that they're behaving differently than the rest of us. To them, they're behaving completely normally. So as a result of going to space, 3 different times, she experienced tremendous impact on her body. And I used her case in my research that I published to NASA, which forced NASA, which not forced them, but they decided to hire 6 female astronauts and 12 male and do long-term body degradation to see if truly man could travel to other planets under 0 gravity. We contacted, in our response to NASA, where we submitted our research results, we suggested that they consider Captain Nowak as the proverbial canary in the coal mine, demonstrating that human spaceflight may not be conducted unless they had artificial gravity environment, decreasing the likelihood of their astronauts acquiring mental illness from atrophy that occurs in 0G. The two programs that the NASA has admitted to doing, and that is sending the astronaut up to space and only being able to stay there for 10 months, and then putting a group of people into a simulated environment like Mars. In the reduction in brain size that may occur from working in zero gravity environments for extended periods, there's been a scientific study that's proven that actually showed a measurable increase in brain size when a serious long-term meditation program was used. So with our understanding and our ability to explain how mental illness is caused, and then the recovery process that we came up with the ability to possibly recover some of your brain size, a lot of the harmful effects of mental illness can be greatly reduced as a result of our research. And so I have here lots of information about Miss Nowak, who, again, because she was mentally ill, and the mentally ill do not know that they're mentally ill, she was willing to take a demotion and get booted out of the astronaut program, out of the Navy, forced to retire and take a cut in pay. And as you can guess, that's not what a normally healthy person decision would be. And so earlier I mentioned about is there any genetic-based connection to mental illness? And what I said was the only one that I would say might be is if the brain fight or flight response does trigger the chemical imbalance that causes mental illness, whether you're going to become bipolar or schizophrenic is likely genetic. And so the argument between is mental illness caused by the environment or by genetics, I say is clearly environment. Since the conscious is one of several interfaces to the world for the subconscious, all information flows from the senses to the subconscious. So mental illness occurs when the conscious ignores all the messages from the fight or flight response. And this occurs frequently in children with a home life where there's major neglect and abuse. And so why does mental illness seem to run in families? Because the parents, if there's mental illness, if the mentally ill have children, clearly they are not in a capacity to raise their children properly and are likely to treat their children as the mentally ill would, where they're not meeting all of their children's needs. So if a group of siblings had a mentally ill mother, those group of siblings are likely to either have some portion of mental illness or emotional illness, and they will then raise their children quite often the way they were raised. And if the raising was neglectful and harmful, you can then pass on mental illness from great-grandparents to parents onto children. And then again, if there was siblings involved under one mentally ill parent, that mental illness will go down with the other siblings as well. So the mere fact that mental illness seems to run in families is evidence that it's genetic based. You're ignoring that mentally ill people cannot raise children properly. And for many years, we did not have the psychotropic drugs that we have now. And so clearly, the mentally ill is pure environment with just a minor item that can be attributed to genetics. As I mentioned before, the fight or flight response or the subconscious is connected to every part of the body through the brain. And so much as with our ability in finding premature aging, we propose to use our prognostic and health management analysis to identify premature aging that was caused from the fight or flight response to the Canadian Space Agency by using data from our circadian and ultradian rhythms, much like we pull out engineering data from circuit boards and are able to predict when that circuit board is going to fail, and when we want to do the same thing to the brain, pull out data from the brain and process it using our algorithms so that we can find premature aging and then predict when that person's going to become mentally ill. And the biological data that we want to diagnose and prognose is, we recommend, just coming from our circadian and ultradian rhythms. And those rhythms are the 24-hour rhythms. The circadian are the 24-hour rhythms that our body uses. They deal with controlling our wake, sleep cycle, body temperature, blood pressure, reaction time, those sorts of things. The ultradian rhythms are the internal rhythms that repeat about every 3 hours. And so there are other rhythms that are available to us too, but the diurnal rhythms, those are ones with, that are synced up to the day and night. And when you're in space, you don't have day and night, so they're of little value. The infradian rhythms are internal rhythms with a period of longer than 24 hours, such as the female's menstrual cycle, which is synced to the orbit of the moon around the Earth, which is 28 days. So those are too long of rhythms. So the two optimal ones are the circadian and the ultradian rhythms. And I'm going to show you, this again is meant to show where the brain is degraded prematurely because of overexposure to adrenaline and cortisol. And so what we hope for is that eventually pharmaceutical companies will eventually produce the drugs that stop or reverse the brain damage to suppress the fight or flight response, which is similar in theory to the drugs that are currently used to suppress the immune system for treating arthritis, as well as when transplants occur. When human tissue transplants occur, our immune system wants to attack it as a foreign body, but we have the drugs to suppress it, to keep it from rejecting, the tissue. The same type of drugs can be developed to control the fight or flight response, which you then get the diseases that are caused by the immune system, that causes both autoimmune system diseases such as arthritis, and then immune system diseases such as cancer would be controlled. So this is a graph much like I showed for the electrical parts, but only this time meant for the different parts of the brain: the frontal lobe, parental, facial, temporal, occipital, and cerebral. So the same kind of aging for each one of those lobes would be different. And this just simply shows that if we were able to get rhythm data, circadian, ultradian rhythm data, we would see the same kind of non-repeatable transient events here that we would be able to detect and predict when the person was going to become mentally ill. And so for astronauts in zero gravity, the area of the brain that generates the ultradian and the circadian rhythms ages prematurely, measurably, and using predictive algorithms to process the biodata, we can identify exactly when the person's going to become mentally ill. And so this is meant to illustrate a diagram of a person's brain from other research that was done, showing the destructive effect of overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline. And you can see from the healthy brain, as it's slowly being reduced, this is the end result of the mentally ill. Starting out here, going down here, and so different areas of the brain are impacted, different sizes. But here is the biggest impact on the size of the brain for overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline. These were the kind of measurements that we said we needed on a regular basis from the astronauts in training in order to be able to predict which astronauts, remember that's what we were hired to do, which astronauts were going to become mentally ill during training. And so here is some data that we would collect. This is the type of data, what it would look like. Here's short-term body temperature, short-term systolic blood pressure, and then normal short-term heart rates. So we would be able to get lots of this data, process it using our algorithms to find the premature aging. Here's what normal short-term circadian rhythms measurements that we would want to be processed for astronauts that were going to go on deep space missions. And then this is what a normal circadian rhythm with melatonin looks like. And this is it as a result of premature aging. You can see there's a significant difference, and we'd be able to pick that up right away and know that the person was suffering greatly and was likely to, if his or her environment was not made safe as determined by the fight or flight response, resulting mental illness would occur. And so how to prevent such things as autism, cancer, diabetes, mental illness, immune and autoimmune system diseases, that's done by knowing how they're caused. And that's what I've been presenting here today, is how they're caused. And that same physiology that causes these occurrences to occur, I'm going to show how they're connected to gender expansion. Now, AIDS research is really the big breakthrough that we got, because it forced the researchers to go down to the area of the virus. And it turns out that we now know that cancers are caused by viruses as well as AIDS. And in fact, if you get AIDS, quite often you end up with some very, very unusual cancers as a result, because the immune system is compromised. It's no longer able to keep the viruses under control, and so they have a chance to get into the cells, flip the switch on the growth of the cell to uncontrolled growth, causing cancer. Oh, let me say that once we hit the age of 50, our immune system effectiveness decreases by 90%, greatly increasing the likelihood of acquiring cancer if we continue to live a high-stress environment. So after 50, it's essential for long life to switch to a no-stress, low-stress, balanced lifestyle. That decreases the periods that the immune system is suppressed by the fight or flight response, and it lowers the risk of acquiring cancers. And so how we age has been a recent discovery when researchers took a look at the DNA strands. And what they found out was at the end of the DNA strands are these little caps. And they're of different lengths. And they're of different lengths because when a cell reproduces itself, and a cell has the DNA in it, each time a cell reproduces itself, it loses a little piece of the cap. And there's about 50 segments. There's generally 50 segments per each strand of DNA. And so that indicates that we actually have about 50 times for that cell to reproduce itself before it disappears. And so if you've got adrenaline and cortisol through your body for long periods of time, these caps are going to be worn away very, very quickly, and this cell is going to disappear along with many other cells, which then causes premature aging. And remember, that's what my company specializes in, is being able to find premature aging in either electronic equipment or in the human body. And so the aging process that we now understand through the DNA research and the discovery of telomeres, or the caps on the end of the DNA strands, adds to understanding what causes premature death, because the premature loss of these caps means premature aging and premature death. So how a fetus, I'm going to talk next about how a fetus's gender is altered, as well as causes autism, diabetes, arthritis, mental illness, immune and autoimmune system diseases that occur, that changes the essential in the development of the fetus. So all this time I've been talking about what happens in adults or children when the fight or flight response triggers the chemical imbalance in the brain, trying to get the attention of the conscious mind in order to take the right actions for the fight or flight response to believe it's safe. So now I'm going to be talking about the fetus. And so using if the same physiological process that occurs in adults and children that cause mental illness occurs while the fetus is in the mother's womb, that is where all of these things that I mentioned will occur. And so let me see if I can get in the 38-week gestation period. If the mother is living a dangerous environment as determined by the fetus's fight or flight response, we believe that the fetus's fight or flight response, we believe that all systems within the baby are working by week 6. That That's also the week in which if the fetus is going to turn into a male, testosterone shows up. So if during this period when the fetus is developing, if it decides that its mother is living in a dangerous environment for too long, that it will do the same thing that the brain does as an adult, and that is will change the chemical balance in the brain while the fetus is developing. And if it does so, it can cause autism, which would be nothing more than the synapses not developing properly as a result of the chemical imbalance, and as well as any other changes within the brain, which would include possibly altering the gender, which is controlled psychologically in the brain. And so in what occurs to a developing fetus's brain when its fight or flight response induces the same chemical change that causes mental illnesses in people, you get, at birth you'd have childhood autism, at birth and possibly later, emotional illnesses, mental illnesses. You could have a difference between the psychological gender of the fetus's brain versus its physical gender, and any combination thereof. And so gender expansion doesn't have to occur just at birth, and it doesn't have to occur just during gestation. It can start here, but finish later on in life, allowing people to change gender, either psychological gender, anytime later on in life where stress in their life triggers the presence of cortisol and adrenaline. As I was saying, in the gestation period of the child for fetal growth, if the same physiological behavior that occurs in adults and children occurs during the fetus's development, all of the things that I've been talking about can occur. Gender expansion, autism, childhood arthritis, diabetes occurs as the immune system is suppressed. The viruses grow and attack the insulin-producing cells within the pancreas. Cancer grows as a result of more viruses being present. More viruses means more viruses getting into cells that may accidentally trigger the growth part of the growth switch in the cell. And so the variety of changes that can occur to a fetus in the event that it decides, the fight or flight response decides that its outside environment is dangerous and it needs to do something about it, much as occurs in adult. All of these things are possible. And so in NASA's, remember I started this with our work for the Canadian Space Agency. When we submitted our research requesting all future manned space missions use artificial gravity, I think I've covered all this. They hired 6 new females, 12 males, and then had to stop that program. They are publishing the results of the first twin that went into space that came back after 10 months. And so, in summary, the actions by a fetus or a person's fight or flight response can cause gender altering, cancer, mental illness, autism, diabetes, arthritis, and all immune and autoimmune system diseases, and all non-genetic based diseases. That's how powerful the fight or flight response is and its effect on us. Mental illness is caused by the fight or flight response as brain damage from premature aging due to overexposure to cortisol and adrenaline. And that occurs when the fight or flight response determines that it's powerless and out of control over the conscious and its ability to remove threat that it identifies. The fight or flight response uses mental illness after birth as a message to the conscious that it wants actions to be taken to make it safe. If the needs of the fight or flight response are not met either by an adult or the fetus, it causes permanent brain development changes that can result in psychological gender altering, as well as all of the other childhood conditions. And later in life, it can set into motion both emotional and mental illnesses. in infants, children, and adults. And back to the space program, mental illness occurs on NASA's manned space missions, and more frequent mental illnesses will occur during future NASA and private space missions, either in low Earth orbit, going to the moon, or in deep space missions, if artificial gravity is not provided. Using PHM analysis and data from our circadian and ultradian rhythms allows astronauts and space tourists to prevent and recover from mental illness during future space missions. And the progression of the fight-or-flight response-caused diseases can be stopped by meeting the needs of the fight-or-flight response, which is moving into a balanced lifestyle. And the need for medications can be reduced or eliminated by learning to identify and remove the threats as defined by the person's fight-or-flight response. And so our conclusions are the fight-or-flight response triggers gender expansion most often as a fetus, and our psychological and physical conditions as children and adults and our longevity are well outside our conscious awareness. The fight-or-flight response is always in control of our behavior and always allows the conscious to make only minor decisions. And so we believe we're in control of our life. The body's health is controlled in only a minor way by our conscious mind, and major diseases and death occur from our fight-or-flight response that is meant to keep us safe. Ignoring the needs of our fight-or-flight response as determined by it for the conscious's needs will cause severe diseases and premature death. As I mentioned earlier, after age 50, getting into a low-stress, no-stress environment is even more crucial if you want to have longevity. And what's ironic is that our body system that protects us from harm in the short term betrays us later and causes major diseases and premature death if we decide to ignore its messages. Okay, on my previous presentation, I wanted to go back and discuss a little bit. I left off of this chart regarding the symptoms of emotional and mental illnesses. They are believed by the industry, by the pharmaceutical industry, as well as the FDA, to occur when the three chemicals of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine levels are altered. Well, and the symptoms these symptoms are reduced or eliminated when these three chemicals, when the ratios of these are restored using psychotropic medications, confirming that the relationship to mental health. Any performance parameters that correspond to the ratios of signal and noise in hardware communications is like the chemical level imbalance that ratios that decrease the symptoms of emotional and mental illnesses in the brain. And so in this chart, where it's a simplified communications of the brain, this block diagram is very much similar to the one for the computer, where the input into our brain is from our nervous system, our eyes and vision, ears, sound, noise, smell, skin, and touch, is fed into our what we call the primitive brain, or fight or flight response. And from there, it decides how much information that it's going to send up to the conscious, which from there we then create our reality. And then there's a feedback from our reality, back to our conscious mind. And so this is and then from our conscious mind, there's a very, very, very little feedback into our subconscious, but only by using the same inputs that the fight or flight response has, that is our senses. And so the feedback from our conscious has got to be through our voice, through what we say, what we feel with our skin, our touch, our hearing, what we're saying to the fight or flight response. And so in the fight or flight response, with the connection to the brain, as I mentioned before, it has connections to every aspect of the body and can control, if it needs to, everything associated with it. Thank you for your time, and I hope that what I had to say was as informative to you as it was to me, and realizing that the influence, things that are way outside of our realm influence us so greatly. Thank you for your attention. And so these are some of the space programs that I've worked on in the past. I was the GPS, the Boeing GPS Global Positioning System Space and Ground System Manager, responsible for getting the work necessary to get the GPS program funded by the Department of Defense, by the Air Force. The NASA space station, I did design work for it. The NASA space shuttle, we had to redesign to launch 4 GPS spacecraft simultaneously back when the space shuttle was being used to launch military satellites several decades ago. The far one in the corner is a constellation of satellites called Global Star, and it is a independent telephone system in space that doesn't require the use of any ground-based telephone poles or telephone lines or Wi-Fi. And these are this is the constellation of satellites that use what's called a satellite phone. That's one of 2 systems. The other one is called Iridium, and they're competitors to each other. This is the Atlas rocket that is used to launch the GPS satellites. Let me say a little bit about the complexity of the GPS program. These satellites that I was responsible for the design and launch and test of in order to get the program funded, these are at an altitude of 12,000 miles in height off the surface of the Earth. So each one of those satellites is up 12,000 miles. And the satellites for Global Star roughly sit around 400 miles up. And so these are in a 12-hour orbit at 12,000 miles. And what's called the geostationary orbit or geosynchronous orbit, which is a 24-hour orbit, those satellites are up at 22,000 or 24,000 miles up in space along the Earth's equatorial plane. This is a Titan solid rocket launch vehicle. Started out as an ICBM, and I was responsible for the design and test of the solid rocket motor assemblies here. This is the Intelsat 7 satellite that I was responsible for the design, and this is the first satellite ever designed to be used with prognostics and health management technology by myself. And this is the satellite, commercial satellite that I did the design work here in Palo Alto. This is the NASA GOES satellite, where I was the satellite test manager, responsible for the design and test. The work that we did on the Hubble telescope that was built by Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale. I participated in doing some failure analysis work for NASA on the Hubble. This is a picture, this is an artist's concept of the GPS operational satellite that is in this constellation of satellites up here. That is a result of the work that I did in the test and evaluation phase where I was able to get it funded by the Department of Defense. So these satellites, although it's hard to tell, are actually made up of a group of satellites built by Boeing. After I helped win the program funding, my company won enough money, about $4.5 billion for another 52 GPS satellites, and that was used to fill the constellation. Let's see, I think that's about it. So these are just examples of the different space programs and launch vehicle that I was responsible for. And as I mentioned, this Atlas launch vehicle is the one that was used to launch the first 12 what's called Block 1 GPS satellites that I used to generate the technical data that was used to fund it. And GPS at the time was actually competing with 2 different satellite-based navigation programs, one called Timation and the other one called Transit. And they were funded completely by the US Navy in support of their Trident missile programs on their nuclear-tipped, their submarines that had the nuclear-tipped missiles on them. And so there was already 2 existing low-altitude satellite-based navigation systems when we were able to get GPS funded. And eventually those 2 Navy programs were eventually turned off and defunded. And so these are some of the companies that I've worked with and worked for. Everybody from Lawrence Livermore Labs up in Livermore, Boeing down in Southern California, NASA headquarters, NASA Ames, L3 Communications. This is just the US Air Force on the GPS program. And so Lockheed Martin as well, Avaya, these are telecommunication company, Avaya, Tektronix. I was able to embed our predictive algorithms in the equipment that the telecommunications industry uses in order to run the telephone landlines, the old original telephone systems. They can sustain be on fire for 10 minutes. They can operate through an 8.0 earthquake, and they have to be able to operate through the 1 in 100 year flood. And so those are why the old telephone systems always worked whenever there was a natural disaster. And so some of the different industries that PHM technology is currently being applied to includes the medical industry. And in fact, the medical industry has actually been using the process within PHM technology for about the last 2,000 years. Now, investing, the PHM, what's called the prognostic analysis or the predictive algorithms have actually replaced the stockbroker on the floor of the stock exchange. Companies are now using computers and embedded predictive algorithms to decide which stocks and which investments to buy and then when to sell. And 60 Minutes on CBS several years ago did an in-depth story on it. And of the companies that they were able to get that agreed that they were using predictive algorithms to purchase their investments, they all claimed that not one of them had lost one penny. And the process is what we refer to today as the electronic trading. And they actually can trade at a rate of about 40 million transactions a second. And so when you're doing that kind of volume in terms of trades, when you're using electronic trading, it's what causes the investment market to collapse sometimes and get bogged down and shut down because of the sheer magnitude of electronic trades that are possible by using these predictive algorithms from the PHM technology. In law enforcement, predictive policing is just now getting started. The city of Santa Cruz uses predictive policing in order to compensate for a lack of police officers. The city of Salinas does so as well. The city of Los Angeles has also bought the software for predictive policing. And it was developed in order to compensate for the lack of law enforcement employees when the cuts had to occur as a lack of taxes and funding that was available for the police. And so on the east coast of the United States, IBM, the company IBM, has its own version of predictive policing software that it is out marketing to cities in order to compensate for the lack of police officers available on the streets. In just plain engineering, when you use a PHM technology, we effectively add intelligent decision-making, self-prognostic technology, and it can be added to almost any electrical or mechanical products. However, it is so expensive and complex that it's best suited for extremely expensive equipment that would be either too expensive or too important to fail. And so what the predictive algorithms allows to happen is the equipment identifies that it will be failing, and it will notify the personnel, and it will actually tell them when it's going to fail, how much longer is it going to operate. And in that manner, companies can operate their equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if they choose to do so. And in fact, the computer chip industry, all of the companies that make computer chips have switched over to embedding these algorithms into their manufacturing equipment for the silicon wafers, as well as the testing equipment. And in that way, they can optimize the efficiency of their very expensive manufacturing facilities and operate them on a 24/7, 365 schedule. So as I mentioned, in medicine, Canada Space Agency added a predictive medicine program where not just a preventive medicine program, but they started the process of being able to predict what diseases were going to occur in people and when. And in that way, it allows them to be prepared ahead of time. Won't be any such thing as a surprise a problem in the medical field. And so in aerospace, again, aerospace is a lot of electrical and mechanical equipment, so it causes the equipment to become intelligent, decision-making equipment, communicating with other equipment in order to tell it what equipment needs to be either repaired or replaced and when, and thereby eliminating the need for the logistical personnel to be involved, and that lowers the cost of programs, of operations and maintenance costs, and in the end, it improves the profits of the companies that employ it. In geology, we've submitted a design proposal to the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in order to use a satellite-based earthquake prediction and tsunami identification and tracking system where we could actually predict when earthquakes were going to occur, when volcanoes were going to erupt, and more importantly, we would be able to identify the location of large voids close to the surface of the earth where hostile nations may be hiding their weapons of mass destruction. And in Homeland Security, we also submitted a proposal to the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA to allow the development and use of prognostic evidence. And prognostic evidence converts what we now call profiling data. It converts it into scientific evidence which can be used in a court of law to prove a criminal has committed a crime. And it can also be used to predict which individuals will be committing an act of terrorism. And so in general manufacturing, PHM technology stops the problem where people buy something from the store, either say an appliance or an automobile, they bring it home and it fails right away. By using PHM technology at the factory, the personnel are able to identify those products that are going to fail prematurely within the first year of use and not sell them, either repair them or throw them away or do whatever it makes the most sense for that company.